Hey everyone, welcome back. We're here in chapter 27, slide 14. We're going to talk about the reproductive system, specifically about the ovaries, uterus, uterine tube, and associated structures, both internal genitalia and external genitalia. So basically what produces the egg and then on its way to getting fertilized. And yeah, so let's start talking about the ovaries, where eggs are produced. Ovaries there are two of them, just like there are two of testes. There can be two of ovaries, and they're found in the pelvic cavity. Take a look over here on the right side. In this mid-sagittal illustration, it's right here. In this pelvic cavity superior view, posterior is this way, anterior is this way. Uterus is central. It's within the midline of the pelvic cavity. The ovary is off to the side on the wall of the pelvic cavity, and there'd be another one over here. Ovaries develop oocytes. An oocyte is a developing egg. They develop them within rounded structures called follicles. We've seen follicles in the thyroid. There are also follicles in the ovary. It just means a spherical structure. So within this spherical structure of a given ovary, you've got follicles. And you can see developing follicles at different stages here, with the oocyte in the inside that I'm circling here in blue. Eventually, during development of an oocyte, that oocyte is ovulated. It's released from the ovary. To support this development, hormones are needed. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates cells called granulosa cells. We've seen granulosa cells before. Granulosa cells are the ones that produce estradiol. They surround the oocyte in a follicle, and that's why it's called follicle-stimulating hormone. But remember, we saw follicle-stimulating hormone in people with testes as well. As follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates Ch28 cells. But here, follicle-stimulating hormone is stimulating granulosa cells. Granulosa cells then support oogonia. Oogonia are the germ cells that eventually undergo meiosis to produce oocytes. So we see a pattern here. In the testes, we saw follicle-stimulating hormone stimulate Ch28 cells, which stimulated germ cells called spermatogonia. Here we have follicle-stimulating hormone stimulating granulosa cells supporting germ cells called oogonia to produce oocytes. Looking more closely at these follicles, at the developmental stages. There is an earlier stage called the primordial stage. We're going to skip over that. We're going to talk about primary follicles. In our diagram, we're right here, and in histology, we're really close up. This is what one follicle looks like. The oocyte is in the center. I'm going to color this in light blue. This is the oocyte. Granulosa cells are directly surrounding it. I'm going to color this in orange. There's a lot of them, and I've colored 6 of them, 7 of them here. These are all granulosa cells. Granulosa cells are the ones that produce estradiol and also support the developing oocyte. Theca cells, which I'll color in yellow, are flatter. They're more squamous. Theca cells surround the granulosa cells. They also, in this stage, produce estradiol. Both granulosa and theca cells produce estradiol. Estradiol has systemic effects, but it also stimulates this oocyte and helps it grow and develop. If that follicle continues to mature, and not all follicles do, quick note, you may have heard that you're born with all the eggs. If you have ovaries, you're born with all the eggs that you have. That's true, and you have a limited number, but you have plenty in your lifetime, in your childbearing years, to have enough eggs to release. There's plenty. But in short, not some follicles will develop, some won't, and some will just degrade and die off. So of the ones that mature, you get secondary follicles. Secondary follicles are a bit bigger. You still have your oocyte in the center. You still have granulosa cells, but now look at this granulosa cell layer that I'm coloring in orange. Much, much thicker layer of granulosa cells. You have theca cells still, which I'll color in green now. The big difference here, besides the overall growth of the follicle, is that now you're starting to get a space called an antrum that fills up with fluid. Now in these 2 dimensions, it just looks like a crescent. In 3 dimensions, you know, it would be more of like a flat bubble within this sphere. We're getting more and more fluid within this antrum. Why are we getting fluid? We'll see here in a second, but it's really important that we're developing or building up this fluid within this follicle if it's to eventually ovulate. Some of those secondary follicles will become tertiary follicles. You might see called Graafian or just straight up mature follicles. These are the most mature follicles. Not yet ovulated, but more mature. They're getting really big. They're getting so big, the antrum specifically is getting so big that it's pushing the oocyte to one side. You see the oocyte right here. It's been pushed to one side. You still have granulosa cells, you still have theca cells. It's much bigger. The antrum continues to swell. At this point, the follicle is swelling so much that we're starting to bulge on the edge of the ovary. And this is important. Because the antrum is swelling up so much, it's bulging against the edge of the ovary. With the help of another hormone, remember luteinizing hormone, which also comes from the anterior pituitary, like follicle stimulating hormone does. When you get a spike in luteinizing hormone stimulates this tertiary follicle to grow so much that it literally pops. I mean, that doesn't like explode, but you get a break, you get a rupture on the wall of the ovary. You get a rupture on the wall of the ovary, and so now your oocyte ovulates. It exits the ovary. This is the process of ovulation. High amounts of luteinizing hormone lead to weakening of the ovary wall. You get a release of the oocyte. That's what ovulation is. We'll talk about that, what happens to that oocyte in a second, but what remains in the ovary is crucial if a pregnancy is to occur. The leftover granulosa and theca cells form this really large, they continue growing, they form this really large structure of hormone producing cells. This is called a corpus luteum, a luteal body. That's what corpus luteum means. Not only are you producing really high amounts of estradiol, but you're also producing high amounts of progesterone. Together, estradiol and progesterone, the hormone that promotes gestation, they stimulate the lining of the uterus and helps the uterus prepare for a potential pregnancy. The presence of a corpus luteum, again, is essential the presence of a corpus luteum is essential for preparing for and maintaining a potential pregnancy. There we go. If you do have a pregnancy, that corpus luteum will stick around and it'll continue releasing high amounts of estradiol and progesterone throughout pregnancy. If no pregnancy occurs, if sperm never fertilizes an oocyte, then that tissue will no longer be supported. Quick aside, why wouldn't it be supported? What keeps the corpus luteum alive? You need human chorionic gonadotropin. This is a hormone produced by the fetus. Or yeah, developing embryo fetus. It stimulates the corpus luteum to stay alive. It's also, this is the thing that you use in a pregnancy test. It's what you detect in your urine to see if you're pregnant. You're seeing the presence of this hormone. It's a good indicator. Anyways, if you don't have this hormone supporting the corpus luteum will die. It'll regress. It'll just get eaten up by macrophages. The leftover tissue is called the corpus albicans. It's just degrading fibrous tissue, degrading connective tissue. You'll just recycle those cells like you would any other dead cells. Macrophages will eat up the phagocytose, the granulosa and theca cells. That's what we see right here. Once the oocyte is ovulated at that time of the menstrual cycle, it's going to be caught. Take a look at the top right. The oocyte will be caught by these little extensions, kind of like a catcher's mitt. These little extensions are called fimbriae. They're caught by fimbriae of this larger structure, the uterine tube. You might know this as the fallopian tube. I'm going to call it the uterine tube. It's an extension off of the uterus. So the uterine tube catches the oocyte, and it's the site of fertilization. Fertilization does not occur in the uterus. Implantation does. Fertilization occurs in the uterine tube. What should happen next is that the oocyte is supposed to be swept to the uterus, because that's where implantation occurs. So sweeping occurs thanks to simple columnar epithelium with cilia. You see this in this histology, tiny little cilia on the apical side. It's simple columnar with cilia, not pseudostratified with cilia, unlike what we saw in the trachea. We have muscle in this zoomed out picture, thick layer of muscle surrounding the uterine tube to help push the oocyte, potentially zygote, forward by peristalsis. That's normally what happens if there's a pregnancy, if there's fertilization. If the cilia or the muscle don't effectively push the developing zygote forward to the uterus, what can happen is something called an ectopic pregnancy, and that's very dangerous to both a potential baby and the pregnant mother. Usually, those cannot come to term without killing one or the other. So those usually have to be ended. So when it's functioning as it should to lead to a healthy implantation and birth, the cilia in the uterine tube as well as the muscle has to push the fertilized egg, the zygote, forward to the uterus. Take a look at this bottom right cadaver picture inside the pelvic cavity. This way is posterior, this way is anterior. You can see the uterus, which is centrally located. Uterine tube comes out this way, and you can see the fimbriae over here. The ovary is a little off to the side right here. Looking at the uterus and how it could support a potential pregnancy, it's important to understand the layers of the uterus that allow for embryo implantation. Once again, here's a superior view of the pelvic cavity. So this would be the pelvic cavity. You can see the uterus is centrally located. Uterine tubes extend off on either side that way, while the ovaries would be located around right here along the walls, lateral walls. Urinary bladder is anterior / a little bit inferior to the uterus. The uterus, if it grows during pregnancy, it's going to be pushing on the bladder, which is why people who are pregnant, they need to go to the bathroom often. So let them go first. The layers. Take a look at the histology at the top right. Closest to the lumen, we have one layer, the superficial layer, called the endometrium. Endo, because it's towards the inside, endometrium. This is simple columnar on the most apical side, but then you can also see many glands. Let me point a few out. I'm going to circle them in light blue. Look at all these little glands, because the uterus produces a lot of important fluids to the outside, to the apical side, as well as providing lots of blood vessels to support a potential pregnancy. There's many capillaries here. The part that changes throughout the menstrual cycle is called the functional layer. I'm going to highlight it here in yellow. And you can see that this functional layer has all of those glands. The amount of glands changes during the menstrual cycle. The basal layer, which I'll color in dark blue, is the basal layer, and this is the unchanging part. This will always stay constant. Growing off of the basal layer, you'll get more and more glands, more and more blood vessels at peak fertility, and then that will shed off at the end of the menstrual cycle, causing a period. The next layer is the myometrium. Myo means muscle. It is a very large layer. The uterus is very muscular. This is smooth muscle that can be stimulated by oxytocin. Recall oxytocin, it's released by the posterior pituitary. And this is important for contractions, for labor and delivery, or in more annoying situations for causing cramps. So the myometrium helps if there is a baby ready for delivery, then that helps push it out. The very outside of the uterus is perimetrium, thin layer, that's serosa. It's a peritoneal membrane. That functional layer of the endometrium, as I mentioned, will change throughout the cycle. Early in the cycle, you have some glands, some blood vessels. Later in the cycle, you get more and more glands. You can see how much larger these glands are getting. At peak fertility, look at how many glands there are and look at the blood vessels. Do you see the blood filling these spaces? This is peak fertility. If there is no pregnancy, then this functional layer will die off. And that's when you get the menstrual phase, when you get a period and when bleeding occurs. So all of that, most of that functional layer sheds off, and that is released out of the vagina. Why or what's causing these changes? It's due to changing levels of estradiol and progesterone. The types of changes that happen is a little bit complicated. So we're not going to talk about it here. That's something you're going to talk about more in physiology, but it's related to hormonal levels. One thing that I do want you to know, since this is something we've discussed, the blood vessels that supply blood to the uterus, there will be branches of the internal iliac arteries, which come from the common iliac, which comes from the aorta. Take a look at the bottom right. You can see that I'm tracing the uterine cavity, so the space of the uterus. The very end down here, it narrows down. It's neck-like. The word for neck is cervical or cervix. The neck-like portion of the uterus is called the cervix. We're transitioning out to the vagina. So the cervix, which you can also see the opening of right here, and down here we have the vagina, or the vaginal canal, really. And up here we have the uterus. The cervix, by being narrowed, it's allowing for protection, or protecting the uterus from bacterial infection. There's a literal passageway from the vagina so things can come in, and we don't want harmful bacteria to make its way all the way up. That would lead to an infection. Taking a look at the histology, this way is superior, this way is inferior towards the vagina. Well, this is towards the uterus. Towards the uterus, it's simple columnar epithelium. Lots of mucus production to help protect and lubricate the uterus and cervix. But as we transition to the vagina, it's going to become non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium over here. The cervix happens to be one place where cancer is common enough that it's an issue. Human papillomavirus, HPV, can cause cervical cancer. If you have a cervix, one important test to do, especially as you get older, is a pap smear. A pap smear named after a Greek person's name, Papa Nicolau. Anyways, what you're doing is you're taking a swab and you're scraping this area of the cervix. You're taking cells and seeing if they're cancerous. That's what this is. This is a smear of someone's cervical cells. It's non-keratinized stratified squamous, and you're taking these and seeing what these cells look like. If these cells have larger than normal nuclei, it's not the color that matters, it's what the nuclei look like. That's an indicator of cancerous cells. So that's what they're looking for in a pap smear. We've gone from the ovaries to the uterine tube, to the uterus, cervix, and now we're getting to the vagina. The vagina is adapted to protect. It's an orifice. It's an opening to the outside of the body, so there's risk of not only physical damage, but also infection. It contains bacteria and acid to help limit pathogens and also limit sperm mobility. So like I was mentioning, it's an arduous journey for sperm to make its way past the vagina into the uterus, into the uterine tube. We have non-keratinized stratified squamous, just like that distal part of the cervix, so that it can protect. If you look closely, it has rugae. We saw rugae in the stomach. There's rugae. There are folds here in the vaginal wall to allow for expansion during copulation, during childbirth. the vagina can expand and come back to its original shape. So it has rugy and elastic tissue. And it is muscular. The walls of a vagina are muscular. You have that muscle of the myometrium in the uterus. You have a muscular layer continuous with that myometrium. If you take a look at the histology at the top right, you can see in the mucosa layer, you have that non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It's not within the vagina by this point, we're not within the peritoneal cavity, so the very outside is adventitia. And again, you have a large muscular layer continuous with the myometrium. We started with internal genitalia, now we've made our way to the outside. Take a look at well, let's look at the top right first. This is a mid-sagittal cut of a cadaver. Here's the anus. Here's the rectum. So that's digestive. Here is a vaginal opening. And the vagina continues up this way to the uterus. The uterus would be right. I should change color. Here's the uterus. And this large pouch is the urinary bladder. That's all internal. What's external over here, leading to the vaginal opening as well as other things, that's the vulva. Vulva is what you see from the outside. In this bottom left picture, this is with a person lying supine, and we're looking basically from an inferior view at the perineal area, pubic and perineal areas. You can see the vaginal opening. Let me clear this. You can see the vaginal opening right here. Anterior, because remember we're looking from an inferior view, anterior to the vaginal entrance, you can see the urethra. So the urethra, while the urethra for people with vaginas don't have it's not like it's allowing semen or anything in this case, but the urethral opening is located in the same area of the vulva. The urethra is located right there. What the vulva as a whole does is that since you have openings here, you need to protect them. And so you have skin and hair to protect this area. There are two pairs of folds of skin. The labia minora, the smaller lips, that's literally what it means. Smaller lips. Their lips covering the opening. Labia minora directly cover the vaginal entrance, while the bigger lips, labia majora, surround more and cover the whole thing. What's pictured here is the lips spread, the labia spread so that we can see the entrance and the urethra. More anterior of the urethra, we have another structure called the clitoris. The clitoris is located here. It's covered and protected by skin, much like an uncircumcised penis is covered and protected by skin. And the clitoris contains erectile tissue, much like the penis. Both the penis and clitoris developmentally come from the same tissue. Also, the labia, minora and majora, come from the same developmental tissue as the scrotum. More on the clitoris and its similarities to the penis. It becomes engorged with blood during erection. So it has an erection reflex just like the penis does. also controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. Like what we've seen before, we have corpora cavernosa that have arteries that dilate and block venous outflow because this is erectile tissue. If you take a look at these corpora cavernosa, you can see here and here, this is a cross-section of the clitoris in this picture I'm pointing at. There's no corpus spongiosum because the urethra is separate. I suppose there would be spongiosum surrounding the urethra itself. The urethra can be seen right here. But that's separate from the clitoris itself. You can see the clitoris right here, and the clitoris would be right here. If there is a pregnancy and the person has breasts with mammary glands, then those breasts will also be influenced by the high levels of estradiol and progesterone. Not only do they influence the uterus, they also influence other areas of the body like the breasts. Breasts contain mammary glands. All people have mammary glands, but you only see them really develop in pregnant females because of hormones, but anyone with the right hormones could develop more lactating breasts, lactating mammary glands. Pictured here in this cadaver dissection, we see a postmenopausal breast. So this is the right breast that's been cut somewhat sagittally. A lot of adipose tissue in the breast, but if you take a closer look, you can see a duct leading to the nipple. There's ducts that lead to the nipple, and this illustration at the top right illustrates that a little bit better. You can see all these ducts leading out to the nipple. These ducts are carrying milk, potentially, from lactation glands or mammary glands. If you recall, mammary glands are made of apocrine cells, or they are apocrine cells. They grow and shed. And those shed pieces of cells are the fatty, protein-rich fluid that becomes milk. So these are the ducts that they secrete into are stratified cuboidal. If you take a look at the bottom right, let me change colors. If you take a look at the bottom right, you can see an inactive versus an active breast, active mammary gland. These are lobules, and lobules will grow significantly with the right hormones, with estradiol and progesterone. These are actively producing milk by growing and shedding. And they secrete that milk into ducts, and those ducts lead out to the nipple. I've been mentioning hormones this whole time. What are the hormones and what do they do? Estrogen, so estradiol, stimulates the growth of ducts. Progesterone stimulates the growth of the mammary gland itself, so all those lobules. Prolactin also stimulates more lobules, and oxytocin stimulates smooth muscle contraction. So if you recall, prolactin promotes milk production, while oxytocin promotes the movement of milk out of the nipple, promotes the physical release of milk. Those ducts are known as lactiferous ducts. Lactiferous ducts lead to the nipple. Nipples are surrounded by areolas. So areolas are pictured on the skin. They're on the skin itself from the superficial part. They tend to be pigmented a bit, but more importantly, they contain glands, sebaceous glands, for lubrication. If a baby is going to be suckling from that nipple, you want some kind of lubrication because that can get damaged and chafed pretty easily. So that's our quick overview of reproductive systems, ones that have ovaries and uterus, ones that have testes and prostate and other parts. Whoops. The ovaries and uterus are a lot like fruit, that at some parts of the cycle they're not ready, then they're ready, and then if you don't pick it, if you don't use it, then it will have to reset itself. It will shed and have to regrow. While with sperm in the testes, we go through this long journey of preparation. Where is it? Long journey of preparation from the testes into the body, then out of the body again during ejaculation, and you have to prepare for a tough journey ahead because most sperm don't survive. I've drawn out this pathway here from the sperm end, starting at seminiferous tubules, and seeing the contribution of seminal glands and prostate and vulvar urethral glands leading to ejaculation, and also the journey of oocytes from ovaries to the fimbria of uterine tubes, where fertilization might happen. And if fertilization does happen, that means the sperm has to make it into the vagina, to the cervix, to the uterus, to the uterine tubes where they can meet. Implantation happens in the uterus. All right, that's the reproductive system, as well, at least what I'm asking you to know. There's of course a ton more. For instance, there's paraurethral glands and other glands that are similar to the prostate and seminal glands that are found in people with a vagina and uterus. All right, let me know if you have any questions. Leave questions in the comments, discussion. Thanks for watching. I hope you've had an enjoyable experience watching all these videos. You've made it almost, but good luck. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll maybe talk to you later. Take care.